he was trapped in the past, until a cat showed there was still a future. The rain drummed against the windows of the old Victorian house on Maple Street with the persistence of an unwelcome visitor. Edmund Hale sat in his faded armchair, watching droplets race down the glass panes, each one carrying a piece of the grey October afternoon with it. The sound should have been soothing. He remembered how Sarah used to say rain was nature's lullaby, but now it only emphasized the hollow silence that filled every corner of his life. For 3 years, Edmund had existed rather than lived. The house that once buzzed with laughter and the clatter of dinner preparations had become a mausoleum of memories. In the dining room, dust motes danced in the pale light above a table set for one. The second bedroom remained exactly as Sarah had left it before the hospital stays began. Her reading glasses still folded on the nightstand, her favorite lavender cardigan draped over the chair by the window. Even the basement held untouched boxes from their shared dreams, camping gear they'd planned to use for weekend getaways, art supplies for the pottery classes she'd wanted to take, garden tools for the vegetable patch they'd sketched on paper napkins. At 54, Edmund felt ancient. His dark hair, now streaked with premature silver, had grown longer than Sarah would have liked. His once athletic frame had softened from too many microwave dinners eaten standing at the kitchen counter. He still went to work at Morrison's Hardware Depot every day, moving through the motions of customer service and inventory management, but his colleagues had learned not to invite him for after-work drinks or weekend barbecues. Edmund Hale had become a ghost, haunting his own life. The rain intensified, and somewhere beneath the steady patter, Edmund heard something else, a thin, desperate sound that cut through the white noise of the storm. He lifted his head from the sports section he'd been pretending to read and listened. There it was again, a plaintive cry that seemed to come from directly beneath his front porch. Probably just the neighbor's cat, he muttered, returning to his paper. But the sound came again, more insistent this time, and something in its urgency made him set down the newspaper with a sigh. Edmund rarely opened his front door these days. The mailman left packages by the gate. Groceries were delivered to his doorstep, and he'd long since stopped accepting sympathy casseroles from well-meaning neighbors. But the crying continued, and despite himself, he found his feet carrying him toward the entrance hall. The heavy oak door creaked on hinges that hadn't been oiled in months. As Edmund pulled it open, a gust of cool, rain-scented air hit his face, carrying with it the earthy smell of wet leaves and the promise of winter. He peered out into the grey afternoon, expecting to see nothing more than an empty porch and the familiar street where he'd lived for 15 years. Instead, crouched beneath the old wicker chair Sarah had painted sky blue one long-ago spring, was a cat. Not just any cat, but a creature that seemed to have materialized from the storm itself. Its fur was a deep charcoal grey, almost black in the dim light, with subtle silver markings that caught what little daylight filtered through the clouds. The animal was soaked through, its coat plastered against a frame that spoke of too many missed meals. But it was the cat's eyes that made Edmund pause, large amber orbs that seemed to glow with an inner light, fixed on him with an intensity that was almost human. "Shoo," Edmund said, waving his hand dismissively. "Go on, get out of here." The cat didn't move. Instead, it opened its mouth and released another cry, not quite a meow, but something deeper, more complex, a sound that seemed to contain multitudes of meaning. The animal took a tentative step forward, then another, until it was standing at the threshold of Edmund's door. "I said go away," Edmund repeated, but his voice lacked conviction. There was something about the way the cat held itself, something almost regal despite its bedraggled appearance. It wasn't behaving like a lost or frightened animal. If anything, it seemed to be evaluating him, making some kind of decision. As if that decision had been reached, the cat suddenly darted between Edmund's legs and into the house. "Hey!" Edmund spun around, watching in disbelief as the animal padded confidently into his living room. It paused by the fireplace, shook itself once to shed the worst of the rainwater, then walked purposefully to the center of the Persian rug Sarah had inherited from her grandmother. There, it sat down, wrapped its tail neatly around its paws, and fixed Edmund with that golden stare. Edmund stood frozen in his doorway, rain beginning to pool at his feet. The cat showed no signs of leaving. In fact, it looked remarkably at home, as if it had simply been waiting for someone to open the door and invite it in from the storm. "This is ridiculous," Edmund said to the empty air. "I don't have a cat. I don't want a cat." But even as he spoke the words, He was closing the door against the weather and walking toward his unexpected visitor. The animal watched his approach with calm interest. Up close, Edmund could see that beneath the matted fur was a surprisingly beautiful creature, lean but not malnourished, with intelligent eyes and a coat that would probably shine once it dried properly. A small dark patch on its chest formed an almost perfect diamond shape, and its whiskers were long and elegant. "Where did you come from?" Edmund asked, and was startled when the cat responded with a soft trill, as if it were actually trying to answer. The sound was nothing like the desperate cries that had drawn him to the door. This was conversational, almost friendly. Without quite knowing why, Edmund found himself crouching down to the cat's level. The animal regarded him solemnly for a moment, then did something unexpected. It began to purr. The sound started low and quiet, but gradually grew stronger, filling the silence that had pressed against Edmund's ears for so long. "Vesper," he said suddenly, surprising himself with the word. Where had that come from? The name seemed to have emerged from somewhere deep in his mind, unbidden but somehow exactly right. "Your name is Vesper." The cat's purring intensified, and it stretched one paw forward, just barely touching Edmund's hand where it rested on his knee. The contact was feather-light, but Edmund felt it like an electric shock. When was the last time any living creature had sought his touch? "I can't keep you," Edmund said, but his voice was gentler now. I'm not good with responsibility anymore. I can barely take care of myself." Vesper, and somehow Edmund was already thinking of the cat by that name, simply continued to purr. The animal's eyes never left his face, and Edmund had the strangest feeling that he was being understood in ways that went beyond words. The rain continued its assault on the windows, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled like a sleeping giant. Inside the house, though, the atmosphere had shifted. The oppressive silence that usually filled these rooms had been broken by something as simple as a cat's purr, and for the first time in 3 years, Edmund didn't feel completely alone. Before we continue with the story, I want to ask you for something very special. Please subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, and leave a comment. Every single action makes a difference and helps our project grow. "Just until the storm passes," he told Vesper, standing up and brushing dust from his knees. "Then you'll have to find somewhere else to go." But as he looked down at the cat, now grooming its damp fur with methodical precision, Edmund had the unsettling feeling that Vesper had no intention of leaving. More disturbing still was the tiny voice in the back of his mind, whispering that maybe, just maybe, he didn't want the cat to go either. The thought terrified him. For 3 years, he'd built his life around the careful avoidance of attachment, the deliberate cultivation of numbness. Getting involved with another living creature, even something as simple as a stray cat, felt like opening a door he'd spent so long keeping locked. But as Vesper settled more comfortably on the rug, tucking his paws beneath his body and regarding Edmund with those knowing amber eyes, that door seemed to creak open just a fraction, and for the first time since Sarah's funeral, Edmund wondered what might be waiting on the other side. The next morning brought crisp autumn sunshine, and a problem Edmund hadn't anticipated. Vesper was still there. The cat had spent the night curled in a perfect circle on the living room rug, and when Edmund shuffled to the kitchen in his worn bathrobe and slippers, he found amber eyes watching his every move. Vesper followed him through his morning routine: coffee brewing, toast burning slightly in the temperamental toaster, the daily ritual of checking emails he rarely answered. But instead of the usual suffocating solitude, Edmund found himself oddly aware of his audience. "You're staring," he told the cat, who had positioned himself precisely 3 feet away, close enough to observe, but far enough to maintain dignity. "It's unnerving." Vesper responded with a soft chirp that sounded almost like agreement, then rose gracefully and padded to the back door. There he sat and waited, his message clear as daylight. Edmund hadn't opened that door in over a year. The backyard had been Sarah's domain, her herb garden, her carefully tended roses, her little reading nook under the old oak tree. After her death, he'd let it all go to seed, unable to bear the sight of her empty chair among the overgrown lavender. "I don't go out there," Edmund said firmly, but Vesper simply sat and waited, occasionally glancing back at him with what looked remarkably like expectation. 20 minutes passed, then 30. Vesper didn't move, didn't make a sound, but his presence was impossible to ignore. Finally, muttering about stubborn animals and his own weakness, Edmund unlocked the door and pulled it open. The cat shot outside like a grey arrow, immediately beginning an intensive exploration of the neglected garden. Edmund watched from the doorway as Vesper investigated every corner, every overgrown bed, every tumble of wild roses that had long since escaped their trellises. The animal moved with purpose, pausing here and there to sniff intently at something only he could detect, and despite himself, Edmund found his gaze following not just the cat, but the garden itself. When had the maple tree grown so tall? The tomato plants Sarah had lovingly tended were now towering weeds, but they'd somehow managed to produce a handful of late-season fruit. The herb garden was a tangle of mint and rosemary and thyme, but the scents that drifted toward him on the morning breeze were achingly familiar and somehow comforting. Vesper had found something interesting near the old potting shed, a tangle of morning glory vines that had completely overtaken what used to be a neat row of marigolds. The cat sat among the heart-shaped leaves and purple flowers, looking back at Edmund as if to say, "Well, are you coming?" Before he could talk himself out of it, Edmund stepped onto the weathered deck. The boards creaked under his weight. When had they gotten so loose? He made it as far as the steps before stopping, his chest tight with memories. This was where Sarah used to sit with her morning coffee, planning her day among the flowers. This was where she'd called him outside one evening to see the first fireflies of summer. This was where— "Moreau," Vesper said from his position in the morning glories, and something in the sound broke through Edmund's paralysis. The cat wasn't asking for the past, he was asking for the present. Edmund found himself walking across the overgrown lawn, feeling morning dew seep through his old slippers. Up close, the garden was even more chaotic than it had appeared from the house, but there was a wild beauty to it that he hadn't expected. Volunteer sunflowers had sprung up near the fence, their faces turned toward the sky in eternal optimism. A trellis, heavy with untended grapevines, created a natural archway that Sarah would have loved. "It's a mess," Edmund said aloud, but Vesper had moved on to investigate a butterfly that was sampling the overgrown bee balm. The cat's hunting instincts were engaged, but he made no move to actually catch the butterfly. Content, it seemed, simply to observe and appreciate. That afternoon, Edmund found himself standing in the gardening section of his own hardware store, staring at pruning shears as if they were artifacts from an alien civilization. He'd been coming to this same section every day for 3 years, helping customers choose the right tools for their projects, but he'd never considered that he might need any of them himself. "Those are good ones," said a voice behind him. Edmund turned to see Tom Bradley, one of his regular customers, a retired teacher who maintained the most pristine yard in the neighborhood. Sharp enough to make clean cuts, but not so heavy they'll wear you out. "Oh, I was just—" Edmund fumbled for an explanation that wouldn't require him to admit he was considering gardening again. Tom smiled knowingly. "Saw you had a visitor this morning. Grey cat, sitting in your garden like he owned the place." Word traveled fast in their small corner of Maplewood. Edmund shouldn't have been surprised that his neighbors had noticed Vesper's arrival, but something about Tom's tone suggested more than idle curiosity. "He's not staying," Edmund said quickly. "Just a stray taking shelter from the storm." "Uh-huh." Tom hefted a bag of mulch onto his shoulder with the ease of long practice. "Well, if that temporary visitor happens to stick around, you might want to do something about that back fence. There's a section that's been loose for months. Perfect escape route for a curious cat." Edmund found himself purchasing the pruning shears, along with a small bag of lawn fertilizer and a packet of wildflower seeds he couldn't explain. When he got home, Vesper was waiting by the back door again, this time with a small gift, a perfectly round stone from somewhere in the garden, deposited neatly on the doormat. "What's this supposed to be?" Edmund asked, picking up the smooth grey pebble. Vesper purred and rubbed against his leg, then headed straight for the garden. That evening, as the sun painted the sky in shades of rose and gold, Edmund found himself outside with the new pruning shears in his hand. He told himself he was just clearing a path so Vesper wouldn't get tangled in the overgrown roses, nothing more. But one careful cut led to another, and then another, until he'd freed an entire section of Sarah's old flower bed from its prison of weeds. Vesper supervised from his post atop the potting bench, occasionally offering commentary in the form of soft trills and chirps. The cat seemed particularly interested when Edmund discovered a cluster of late-blooming asters hiding beneath a tangle of Virginia creeper, their purple faces bright as stars in the gathering dusk. "She planted these," Edmund said, not sure why he was talking to a cat, but unable to stop himself. Said they were for the butterflies, late-season food, when everything else was dying back for winter. Vesper jumped down from his perch and rubbed against Edmund's leg, purring so loudly it seemed to vibrate through the cooling air. The sound was warm and comforting, like a balm applied to wounds Edmund had forgotten he was carrying. As the stars began to appear overhead, Edmund gathered up the pile of weeds and dead branches he'd cleared. His back ached. It had been too long since he'd done this kind of physical work, but it was a good ache, the kind that came from accomplishment rather than defeat. The small section of garden he'd reclaimed looked raw and vulnerable in the moonlight, but there was potential there now, space for new growth. Tomorrow, he told Vesper, who was now investigating the newly cleared soil with obvious approval. We'll see about fixing that fence Tom mentioned. The word "we" slipped out before Edmund could catch it, and he felt a flutter of panic in his chest. When had he started thinking in terms of "we"? When had this temporary arrangement begun to feel permanent? But as he looked down at Vesper, who was now sitting in the center of the cleared garden bed like a small grey sentinel, Edmund found he couldn't quite bring himself to regret the slip of tongue. For the first time in 3 years, the word "tomorrow" held something other than dread. The cat looked up at him with those knowing amber eyes, and Edmund had the strangest feeling that Vesper was proud of him. Not for the gardening, any fool could pull weeds, but for something deeper, for the simple act of engaging with life again, even in the smallest way. "Don't get too comfortable," Edmund warned as they headed back inside. "This doesn't mean you're staying." But even as he said it, he was already planning where to put a litter box, wondering what kind of food cats preferred, thinking about a dozen small accommodations that would make Vesper's temporary stay more comfortable. The revolution had begun so quietly he'd barely noticed, but as Edmund locked the back door behind them and watched Vesper settle confidently onto his chosen spot on the living room rug, he realized there was no going back. The cat had opened a door Edmund thought he'd sealed forever, and despite his fears, despite his carefully constructed walls of isolation, he found himself curious about what lay beyond the threshold. 2 weeks after Vesper's arrival, Edmund discovered that living with a cat involved more than simply sharing space. It required paperwork. The Maplewood Homeowners Association had rules about pets, and Mrs. Patterson from 3 houses down had taken it upon herself to inform Edmund that his temporary visitor would need to be properly registered if it was going to remain in the neighborhood. The conversation had taken place over his front fence on a crisp November morning, with Vesper sitting boldly on the porch railing as if he owned the place. "It's just a matter of filling out the forms," Mrs. Patterson had explained with the cheerful efficiency of someone who'd spent her retirement years mastering neighborhood bureaucracy. Vaccination records, registration with the county, proof that the home environment is suitable, nothing too complicated. But as Edmund stood in his living room that evening, holding the thick packet of forms Mrs. Patterson had delivered, suitable home environment felt like a mountain he wasn't sure he could climb. The questionnaire was thorough and unforgiving. Adequate space for exercise and play, secure windows and exits, removal of hazardous materials, provision of appropriate furniture, and enrichment activities. Edmund looked around his house with fresh eyes and saw it as the association would: dusty surfaces that hadn't been properly cleaned in months, windows that hadn't been opened since Sarah's funeral, rooms that had been closed off and forgotten. The dining room still held towers of unopened mail and boxes of medical bills he'd never found the courage to sort through. Sarah's craft room had become a repository for everything he couldn't bear to look at but couldn't bring himself to throw away. "This is impossible," he told Vesper, who was perched on the windowsill watching evening joggers pass by. "They want a home, not a museum." The cat turned and regarded him with those inscrutable amber eyes, then jumped down and padded purposefully toward the stairs. At the bottom step, he paused and looked back at Edmund, clearly expecting him to follow. "I don't go up there," Edmund said automatically. The second floor had been their floor, his and Sarah's, the master bedroom where she'd spent her final weeks before the hospital, the guest room that was supposed to become a nursery someday, the home office where they'd planned their future together over spreadsheets and dreams. Vesper sat down and waited. "I can't," Edmund said, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. For 2 weeks, this cat had been gently but persistently pushing at the boundaries of his carefully constructed isolation. The garden had been just the beginning. Vesper made a soft sound, something between a chirp and a question mark, then began climbing the stairs. At the top, he paused and looked back, his message unmistakable. Some doors were meant to be opened. Edmund's heart was hammering as he followed the cat upstairs. The hallway stretched before him like a corridor in a museum of his former life, each closed door holding memories he'd tried so hard to lock away. Vesper stopped at the master bedroom and sat down, waiting. The door handle felt cold under Edmund's palm. Behind this door was the bed where Sarah had spent her last morning at home, insisting she felt well enough to try making pancakes. Behind this door were her clothes, her books, her pillow that probably still held traces of her lavender lotion. Behind this door was everything he'd lost. But Vesper was watching him with an expression that somehow conveyed both patience and expectation, and Edmund found his hand turning the handle before his courage could fail him. The room was exactly as he'd left it 3 years ago. Dust motes danced in the afternoon light that filtered through curtains Sarah had sewn herself. Her reading glasses sat on the nightstand next to a romance novel, with a bookmark still marking her place on page 247. The closet door stood slightly ajar, revealing the sleeve of her favorite cardigan. Edmund's breath caught in his throat, but instead of the crushing weight of grief he'd expected, he felt something different, a bittersweet ache that was almost bearable. Vesper jumped onto the bed and began kneading the coverlet with his paws, purring softly. "She would have liked you," Edmund said, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. "She always wanted a cat, but I was allergic when we first got married. By the time the allergies faded, we were dealing with other things." Vesper settled into a comfortable loaf position on Sarah's side of the bed, as if he'd been doing it for years. His presence somehow made the room feel less like a shrine and more like a space where life had happened. Beautiful, complicated, precious life. Over the next several days, Edmund found himself spending more time in the upper rooms. Not living there, that felt like too much, too soon, but visiting, opening windows to let in fresh air, dusting surfaces that had been neglected too long. Gradually, carefully, sorting through the accumulation of a shared life. The guest room proved to be the most challenging. This was where they'd stored all their plans for the future. Baby clothes they'd bought too optimistically, paint samples for the nursery they'd never needed, books about parenting they'd never had a chance to read. Edmund had boxed everything up after Sarah's diagnosis, unable to bear the sight of dreams that would never come true. But Vesper seemed to have decided this room would make an excellent cat sanctuary. He claimed the sunny corner by the window, where he could watch birds in the oak tree outside. When Edmund brought up a comfortable chair and small table, telling himself it was just to make the cat more comfortable, he found himself sitting there in the evenings, reading or simply watching Vesper watch the world. The hardest part was Sarah's craft room. She'd been an accomplished seamstress, and had turned the smallest bedroom into a workshop filled with fabrics, patterns, and half-finished projects. Edmund had avoided this room most completely, but the registration form specifically asked about spaces where pets might encounter hazardous materials, pins, needles, small objects that could be swallowed. Vesper led the way, of course. He seemed particularly fascinated by a basket of yarn Sarah had been using for a baby blanket she'd never finished. The cat sniffed delicately at the soft blue wool, then looked up at Edmund with an expression that seemed to ask, "What's the story here?" "She was making that for a baby we never had," Edmund said, his voice thick with old pain. "We tried for years, treatment after treatment, procedure after procedure, and then, when we finally decided to stop trying, she got sick." Vesper jumped into the basket and settled among the yarn, purring. The sight should have been heartbreaking. This living, breathing creature making himself at home among the remnants of dreams that had died with Sarah. Instead, Edmund felt something loosen in his chest. The yarn was still beautiful, the color still perfect. The love that had gone into choosing it was still real, even if the purpose had changed. "Maybe," Edmund said, reaching out to stroke Vesper's soft fur. "Maybe she was making it for you after all. Just took a while for you to arrive to claim it." The registration forms were due on Friday. By Thursday evening, Edmund had transformed the upper floor of his house into something that resembled a home again rather than a mausoleum. Windows had been opened and cleaned, floors vacuumed, furniture arranged with an eye toward both human and feline comfort. The craft room had been reorganized into a combination workspace and cat play area, with Sarah's fabrics stored safely away, but her bright quilts displayed where Vesper could nap in patches of sunlight. As he filled out the final form, describing the adequate enrichment activities he'd provided for his pet, Edmund found himself writing about things he hadn't even realized he'd done. Cat-safe plants in sunny windows, a variety of perches and hiding places, interactive toys made from household objects. Without meaning to, without even noticing, he'd been building a life that included room for joy again. Mrs. Patterson accepted the completed forms with obvious approval, especially when Vesper appeared on cue to demonstrate his contentment by rubbing against her legs and purring. "He's clearly well cared for," she observed, making notes on her clipboard. "And you've done lovely work with the house. It feels alive again." That night, as Edmund sat in the guest room reading while Vesper dozed in the window, he reflected on Mrs. Patterson's words. The house did feel alive again, not because he'd cleaned and organized, but because he'd stopped trying to preserve it as a monument to the past. Sarah's presence was still everywhere, but now it felt like a warm blessing rather than a crushing weight. "You knew, didn't you?" he asked Vesper, who opened one golden eye to regard him sleepily. "You knew I needed to stop hiding from my own life." The cat's purr was his only answer, but it was enough. For the first time since Sarah's death, Edmund fell asleep that night without fearing what tomorrow might bring. Outside the window, the first snow of winter began to fall, covering the garden they'd reclaimed together in a blanket of pristine white that promised new beginnings. The first snowfall brought more than just winter to Maplewood. It brought Helena Drayton. Edmund discovered this on a Saturday morning in early December, when he opened his front door to find a woman in a burgundy wool coat standing on his porch, holding a covered casserole dish and wearing the determined expression of someone on a mission. Vesper, who had developed an uncanny ability to appear whenever visitors arrived, materialized beside Edmund's legs and immediately began weaving around the newcomer's ankles with obvious approval. "You must be Edmund," the woman said, her voice carrying the warm authority of someone accustomed to taking charge. "I'm Helena Drayton from 2 streets over. This is my famous tuna casserole, and before you say you don't need it, let me tell you that my late husband, Frank, would have personally haunted me if I'd let a neighbor face his first winter alone without proper backup food." She was perhaps 60, with silver-streaked auburn hair pulled back in a practical bun and laugh lines that spoke of a life well lived. Her eyes were the same warm brown as coffee with cream, and they crinkled at the corners as she looked down at Vesper, who was now purring loudly enough to be heard from space. "I don't really," Edmund began, but Helena was already stepping into his house with the confidence of someone who'd been invited. "Oh, don't you dare say you don't cook," she said, heading straight for his kitchen as if she'd been there dozens of times before. "Mrs. Patterson mentioned you've been making improvements to the house. That takes energy, and energy requires proper nutrition. Where do you keep your casserole dishes?" Edmund found himself following her, feeling oddly like a guest in his own home. Vesper, the traitor, had attached himself to Helena's heels and was gazing up at her with unmistakable adoration. "I see you've made a friend," Helena said, pausing to scratch behind Vesper's ears. "Mrs. Patterson mentioned him too. Beautiful cat. Looks like he's got some Maine Coon in him, with those ear tufts and that magnificent tail." "He's not really mine," Edmund said automatically, then stopped. When had that stopped being true? Somewhere between the vet visits for shots and the pet registration forms, between the special food bowls and the cat bed that now graced his living room, Vesper had quietly transitioned from temporary visitor to permanent resident. Before we continue with the story, I want to ask you for something very special. Please subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, and leave a comment. Every single action makes a difference and helps our project grow. Helena gave him a look that suggested she wasn't fooled by his protest. "Of course not. Just like this casserole isn't really mine. It belongs to whoever needs it most. Frank always said the best things in life have a way of finding their proper owners." She bustled around his kitchen with practiced efficiency, pulling out serving dishes and utensils, heating the oven, generally transforming the space from Edmund's sterile bachelor quarters into something that felt oddly domestic. Vesper supervised from his perch on one of the bar stools, occasionally offering commentary in his soft trill. "You know," Helena said as she slid the casserole into the oven, "I've been meaning to introduce myself ever since I moved here last spring. Lost Frank 2 years ago this Christmas, and our daughter insisted I couldn't manage that big house in Denver anymore. She was probably right, but I wasn't about to admit it." Edmund found himself pouring coffee. When had he started a fresh pot and settling into what felt like the most natural conversation he'd had in years? Helena had the gift of drawing people out without seeming to pry, asking just the right questions and leaving comfortable silences for him to fill, or not as he chose. Sarah loved to cook, he found himself saying as they sat at his kitchen table, Vesper draped across Helena's lap like a furry shawl. She was always trying new recipes, insisting I taste test everything. I used to joke that I was going to get fat from all her experiments. What was her specialty? Helena asked, and something in her tone made it safe to answer. Italian food. Her grandmother taught her to make fresh pasta, and she was determined to perfect every sauce known to humankind. The kitchen always smelled like garlic and basil and life, I guess. Helena nodded with understanding. Frank was a barbecue purist. Spent every weekend, summer and winter out on the deck with his smoker, convinced he was going to crack the secret to perfect ribs. I used to tease him that he was just avoiding housework, but I'd give anything to smell that hickory smoke one more time. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, two people who understood the particular ache of missing someone who'd been woven into the fabric of everyday life. Vesper's purring provided a gentle soundtrack to their shared grief. The thing is, Helena continued, scratching under Vesper's chin, I think Frank would have liked this fellow. He always said cats were good judges of character, and this one clearly has excellent taste in humans. Over the next several weeks, Helena became a regular fixture in Edmund's increasingly social life. She had an uncanny ability to appear just when he was starting to feel isolated again, usually bearing some excuse about needing help, reaching something on a high shelf, or testing a new recipe. Vesper, it became clear, had appointed himself as matchmaker, always positioning himself strategically to encourage conversations and shared activities. It was Helena who suggested they volunteer together at the Maplewood Animal Shelter's holiday adoption fair. They're always short-handed this time of year, she explained, and you clearly have a way with cats. Besides, Vesper probably has opinions about which families deserve to take home his shelter friends. Edmund's first instinct was to refuse. He wasn't ready for that level of social commitment, but Vesper had taken to sitting by the front door every morning as if waiting for adventures, and something about the cat's expectant posture made saying no impossible. The shelter was controlled chaos on the day of the adoption fair. Families with excited children wandered between rows of hopeful animals, while volunteers tried to facilitate perfect matches. Edmund found himself assigned to the cat section, where his gentle manner and obvious affection for felines made him surprisingly effective at helping nervous animals show their best sides to potential adopters. You're a natural at this, said Maria Santos, the shelter director, as she watched Edmund coax a shy tortoiseshell cat out of her hiding spot for the third family that day. Have you considered becoming a regular volunteer? The idea should have terrified him. Regular commitments meant regular human interaction, accountability, the risk of disappointing people who were counting on him. But as he watched the tortoiseshell finally warm up enough to purr for a gentle 8-year-old girl, Edmund felt something he'd almost forgotten, the satisfaction of making a positive difference in the world. Maybe, he said, surprising himself, I'd have to check with my supervisor first. He glanced toward Vesper, who was holding court in a sunny corner, graciously accepting pets from children while maintaining the dignified air of a shelter ambassador. By the end of the day, 17 animals had found new homes, including the shy tortoiseshell and a one-eyed tabby who'd been at the shelter for 6 months. Edmund's back ached from kneeling on concrete floors. His clothes were covered in cat hair, and he felt more energized than he had in 3 years. Same time next month? Helena asked as they packed up supplies and prepared to head home. Edmund looked over at Vesper, who was now riding regally in the cat carrier Helena had insisted he needed for proper transportation. The cat met his eyes with a steady amber gaze that seemed to say, Well, are we doing this or not? Same time next month, Edmund agreed, and felt another piece of his carefully constructed isolation crumble away. That night, as he filled out the volunteer application Maria had pressed into his hands, Edmund realized that somewhere in the past month he'd started saying yes more often than no. Yes to Helena's casseroles and conversation. Yes to opening his house to registration inspectors. Yes to spending his Saturday helping other animals find the kind of home Vesper had created for himself. The cat in question was curled up on the couch beside him, one paw draped over Edmund's leg, in a gesture of easy intimacy that would have been unthinkable just months before. Outside, snow continued to fall, but inside the house felt warm and alive with possibility. Edmund reached over to scratch Vesper's ears, marveling at how completely this small creature had transformed his world. "You planned this whole thing, didn't you?" he asked softly. Vesper's purr was his only answer, but it sounded suspiciously like satisfaction. Spring arrived in Maplewood with the persistence of hope itself, and with it came a crisis that would test everything Edmund had learned about opening his heart again. The call came on a March morning when daffodils were just beginning to push through the last patches of snow in Sarah's garden. Maria Santos's voice was strained with exhaustion as she explained the situation. The shelter's heating system had failed during an unexpected late winter storm, and they had less than 24 hours to find temporary housing for 37 cats before the building became uninhabitable. "I know it's a lot to ask," Maria said, her voice thick with worry, "but you're one of our most reliable volunteers, and Vesper has proven that your home is perfect for fostering. Could you possibly take even 2 or 3 cats, just until we can get the repairs done?" Edmund looked across his kitchen at Vesper, who was sitting in his usual spot by the window, ears pricked forward as if he could hear both sides of the conversation. The cat's amber eyes seemed to hold a question. "Well, what are we going to do about this? How many do you need homes for?" Edmund asked, surprising himself. 37 total. We've managed to place about half with other volunteers and partner organizations, but we're still short by—" "I'll take 20, Edmund said, the words emerging before his rational mind could intervene. There was silence on the other end of the line. Then, "Edmund, did you say 20? Because I thought you said 20, but that would mean—" "20 cats, Edmund confirmed, looking around his house with new eyes. "I have the space, and Vesper can help me manage them. When do you need me there?" 3 hours later, Edmund's carefully ordered life had been transformed into organized chaos. His living room had become a temporary adoption center, complete with borrowed crates, scratching posts, and enough litter boxes to stock a small pet store. Helena had arrived with military efficiency, bringing supplies and volunteer friends who helped transform Edmund's dining room into a quarantine area for cats who might be getting sick. Vesper had appointed himself as official greeter and mediator, somehow managing to touch base with each new arrival while maintaining perfect calm in the face of 20 frightened, confused animals who'd been uprooted from their familiar shelter environment. "This is insane," Edmund muttered as he watched an orange tabby kitten attempt to scale his curtains, while a dignified Persian cat claimed Sarah's old reading chair. "What was I thinking?" "You were thinking like someone who knows what it feels like to need a safe place during a storm," Helena said quietly, appearing at his elbow with a fresh cup of coffee. "Frank would have done the same thing. Some people are just built to be shelters for others." The first 24 hours tested every organizational skill Edmund had developed during his years managing inventory at the hardware store. Feeding schedules had to be coordinated, medications administered, personalities managed as territorial disputes arose between cats who'd never met before. He found himself mediating between a cranky tortoiseshell who'd claimed the sunny spot by the back door and a young tabby who was convinced the entire house should be his personal playground. Through it all, Vesper remained a calming presence, seeming to understand instinctively which cats needed gentle encouragement and which needed space to adjust. Edmund watched in amazement as his cat, when had he stopped qualifying that thought, took a frightened black kitten under his wing, grooming her until she relaxed enough to eat. "He's remarkable," said Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the veterinarian who'd volunteered to make house calls during the emergency. "I've never seen a cat so naturally suited to managing group dynamics. Have you considered training him as a therapy animal?" The idea was intriguing, but Edmund was too exhausted to think beyond the immediate crisis. By the 3rd day, however, patterns had emerged. The cats had sorted themselves into comfortable groupings throughout his house, with Vesper serving as a bridge between different factions. The Persian had become fast friends with an elderly tabby who'd been at the shelter for over a year. The orange kitten had bonded with a young calico, and they'd turned Edmund's guest room into their personal playground. Most remarkably, adoption inquiries had begun pouring in. Word had spread through Maplewood's social networks about the man who'd opened his home to 20 shelter cats, and families who'd never considered pet adoption were stopping by to meet the temporary residents. "It's like a live-in adoption fair," Maria observed as she watched Edmund facilitate a meeting between a retired couple and the dignified Persian. "The cats are so much more relaxed here than they ever were at the shelter. They're showing their true personalities." Edmund had to admit it was true. Away from the stress of the shelter environment, the cats were blooming. The shy tortoiseshell who'd hidden for months in her cage was now sunning herself confidently on his porch. A senior cat with diabetes was managing his condition beautifully in the quiet environment of Edmund's home office. Even the orange kitten, who'd been too overwhelmed to play at the shelter, was now demonstrating his acrobatic skills for potential adopters. "Mr. Hale?" said 8-year-old Sophie Chen, tugging on his sleeve as her parents filled out adoption paperwork for the calico kitten. "How did you know Butterscotch wanted to live with us?" Edmund knelt down to Sophie's level, glancing over at Vesper, who was sitting nearby with what looked suspiciously like a satisfied expression. "Well," he said, "I think she told my cat Vesper, and he told me. Cats are very good at knowing which humans will make the best families." By the end of the week, 17 of Edmund's temporary residents had found permanent homes. The shelter's heating system had been repaired, and the remaining 3 cats, the elderly Tabby, a special needs cat with one eye, and a pregnant calico who'd arrived just as the crisis began, had found their way into Edmund's heart in a way that made returning them unthinkable. "I think," he told Maria as they signed the adoption paperwork, "Vesper could use some company. And this house has always been meant for a family." Maria smiled as she watched Vesper supervise the pregnant calico's exploration of the nursery, the room that had once held Edmund and Sarah's dreams and was now being transformed into a safe space for new life. "I think you're right. And Edmund, what you did this week, it was extraordinary. You didn't just save 20 cats. You showed this whole community what it means to open your heart when others need shelter." That evening, as the last of the adoption families departed and the house settled into its new normal, Edmund found himself in the garden with Vesper and their 3 new family members. The pregnant calico, whom he'd named Hope, was carefully inspecting the herb bed that had grown lush and green through the winter. The elderly Tabby, Winston, had claimed the sunny spot by the roses. Patches, the one-eyed cat, was attempting to catch the last fireflies of the evening. "Sarah would have loved this," Edmund said, watching as Vesper groomed Hope with gentle thoroughness. "All of it. The chaos, the community, the new beginnings." As if summoned by his words, Hope suddenly went very still, then looked up at Edmund with wide eyes. "Oh," he said, understanding immediately. "Oh, it's time, isn't it?" The next several hours blurred together in a symphony of careful preparation and quiet miracle. Helena arrived with warm towels and encouragement. Dr. Walsh came by to monitor the birth, and one by one 4 tiny kittens entered the world in the room that had once held only dreams of the children Edmund and Sarah would never have. As dawn broke over Maplewood, Edmund sat in the rocking chair Sarah had chosen for their someday nursery, watching Vesper stand guard over Hope and her babies. The scene was perfect and heartbreaking, and full of a joy he'd thought he'd lost forever. "You knew," he whispered to Vesper, who looked up at him with those knowing amber eyes. "From that first day in the rain, you knew exactly what I needed. Not just companionship, but purpose. Not just a reason to open the doors, but a reason to keep them open." Vesper purred and returned his attention to the new family, but not before giving Edmund a look that seemed to say, "We're just getting started." As the sun climbed higher, painting the nursery in shades of gold and possibility, Edmund realized that grief and joy weren't opposites after all. They were dance partners, each giving meaning to the other. Sarah was still gone, and that loss would always be part of him, but life, he'd learned, was bigger than loss. Life was Vesper's insistent purr on a rainy afternoon. Life was Helena's casseroles and friendship. Life was 20 frightened cats learning to trust again. Life was 4 tiny kittens taking their first breaths in a room built for love. "Thank you," he said quietly, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to Vesper, to Sarah, or to the universe that had sent a small grey cat to teach him that even hearts buried in winter could bloom again come spring. Outside the window, the garden was waking up. The daffodils Sarah had planted years ago were in full bloom, and the fruit trees she'd chosen for their beauty and practicality were heavy with blossoms. Soon there would be tomatoes and herbs, flowers for cutting and vegetables for Helena's casseroles. Soon there would be kittens tumbling through the grass and adoption families coming to meet them, and the sound of laughter filling rooms that had been silent too long. Vesper had shown him the most important truth of all. Love doesn't end when someone dies. It just finds new ways to grow, new hearts to fill, new lives to touch. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, It arrives on your doorstep in the form of a rain-soaked cat who refuses to take no for an answer. The future, Edmund understood now, wasn't something that happened to you. It was something you chose to create, one small act of courage at a time. One door opened, one garden tended, one heart willing to risk being broken again for the chance to love again. And in a house in Maplewood, where 4 kittens slept safely in their mother's warmth while their guardian cat watched over them all, that future was already beginning.